You didn't start out being careful. At first, you spoke the way you always had. You said what you meant. You didn't scan every sentence before letting it out. You didn't measure how it might land. You trusted your words. You assumed they would be heard the way you intended. That if something needed to be said, you could just say it. Simple. Nothing dramatic happened to change that. No big moment, no clear turning point. It was small things. A look that lingered. A tone shift you couldn't name. A response that felt slightly off. You noticed it, but you couldn't point to it. So you kept talking the same way. You said things directly. You asked questions without padding. You shared thoughts as they came. And each time, something subtle followed. Not an argument, not a fight. Just a quiet change in the air. You began to notice that some words landed heavier than you expected. That some sentences slowed the room down. That certain topics made people withdraw without saying why. You told yourself it was nothing. That people were tired, busy, in their own heads. You didn't change yet. You were still speaking naturally. You just started paying attention. You started noticing patterns. Not all at once, gradually. A sentence that felt fine to you would land strangely. A question would be met with silence. A simple comment would change the tone of the room. No one said anything directly. That was the confusing part. You weren't corrected, you weren't challenged, you were just met differently. Shorter replies, polite nods, a shift in posture, eyes moving away. You noticed which words seemed to cause it. Direct ones, clear ones. Anything that didn't leave much room to reinterpret. You noticed how often you were told, "You're very honest," or "You're blunt," or "You don't sugarcoat things." It sounded like observation. It didn't feel neutral. You started replaying conversations afterward, not to criticize yourself, to understand what you had missed. You compared what you said with what happened next. You couldn't find anything wrong with your words. They weren't cruel. They weren't careless. They were just precise. Still, you noticed the effect. Some people relaxed when you softened, when you laughed things off, when you added a buffer around what you really meant. Others seemed more comfortable when you kept things light, when you stayed vague, when you didn't go straight to the point. You didn't change yet, but you were learning. You were learning which words slowed things down, which ones made people uneasy, which ones seemed to cost you something, even when they were true. And you started keeping quiet notes about it. The same small moments kept showing up. You would say something honestly, nothing sharp, nothing unkind. And the response would come back thinner than you expected, shorter, less open. You noticed how often your words were met with, "It's fine," or "Don't worry about it," or "You're reading too much into things." Not said harshly, said casually, as if the conversation should move on now. You began to recognize the rhythm. You speak clearly, the room cools, someone smooths it over. It happened often enough that you stopped calling it coincidence, but not often enough that you felt justified in naming it. You watched how others spoke, how they padded their sentences, how they laughed before making a point, how they softened everything in advance. You noticed how rarely people said exactly what they meant, how much was implied instead, how often things were left unsaid but still understood. You started wondering if you were the odd one out, not because you were wrong, because you were direct. You noticed how often clarity created a pause, a gap, a moment that someone else had to fill. And someone always did. They changed the subject, they joked, they moved things along. And slowly you began to see the pattern. Your words didn't break anything, they just didn't fit the way things were done. You began to change the way you spoke. Not suddenly, quietly. You added small cushions to your sentences, a laugh before a point, a softer tone, a phrase like, "I might be wrong," even when you weren't unsure. You noticed how often you edited yourself mid-thought. You would start a sentence one way, then reroute it before it landed. You chose safer words, rounder words. You learned to test the room before saying what you really meant. You watched faces. You listened for tone. You waited for the right moment, even when you didn't know what that meant anymore. You stopped asking some questions out loud. You kept them in your head instead. You decided they weren't necessary, or that they could wait, or that they might make things awkward. You noticed how much effort went into this. Speaking used to feel natural. Now it felt managed. You prepared sentences before saying them. You checked them for edges. You removed anything that sounded too direct. You didn't want to be misunderstood. You didn't want to be seen as difficult. You told yourself this was growth, that you were becoming more socially aware, that this was how adults communicate. You learned when to stay vague, when to nod instead of respond, when to let things pass even if you disagreed. People seemed more comfortable this way. Conversations flowed more easily. The room stayed warmer. So you kept doing it. You were still honest, just quieter about it. And over time, being careful stopped feeling like a choice. It started feeling like a rule you followed without thinking. Living this way began to change how you felt inside conversations. You noticed how often you held words back, not because they weren't true, because you didn't want to manage what would come after them. You felt the work of it, the weighing, the editing, the softening. Every sentence passed through a filter before it reached your mouth. You became aware of timing more than meaning, of when to speak, not what to say. You watched for moments that felt safe enough. You avoided moments that felt fragile. You noticed how quickly you adjusted yourself when you sensed discomfort. A half smile, a quick laugh, a change of subject. You smoothed things out before anyone asked you to. Over time, this created distance, not from others, from yourself. You would think something clearly and then translate it into something easier, kinder, lighter, less precise. You learned how to make your thoughts smaller. You noticed how often you left conversations feeling unfinished, like you had been present but not fully there, like something real stayed behind. You started doubting your own reactions, not because they were wrong, because you rarely voiced them anymore. They stayed internal, unchecked, unshared. You told yourself this was just being considerate, that not every thought needed air, that harmony mattered. But you felt a quiet loss. You missed the ease of speaking without calculation. You missed trusting your words to stand on their own. You missed not having to prepare for impact. Nothing dramatic happened, no clear conflict, no moment you could point to, just a slow narrowing. You were still speaking, just less like yourself. You noticed how tired you felt after ordinary conversations, not because they were difficult, because you had been working the whole time, watching, adjusting, choosing every word with care. You would replay things later, not what they said, what you said. You checked for moments you could have phrased better, softer, smaller. You noticed how often you wished you had said something differently, not because it was wrong, because it might have landed more easily. You felt yourself becoming quieter in ways you hadn't planned. You stopped offering first thoughts. You waited to see where others went before speaking. You started asking yourself, is this worth saying? Not because it wasn't true, because of what it might start. Over time, you felt a distance growing, not from people, from your own voice. You knew what you thought, but it felt further away from your mouth. You missed the version of you that spoke without rehearsal, without editing, without preparing for reaction. You didn't disappear, you adapted. But adaptation started to feel like loss. and you hadn't named what that was costing you. There was one thing you eventually noticed. You weren't choosing your words because you wanted to be kind. You were choosing them because you had learned what happened when you didn't. You hadn't been told to be careful. You had been shown in small reactions, in pauses that lingered, in smiles that didn't reach all the way. You noticed how automatic it had become, how your first instinct was now to soften, to cushion, to round off anything that might feel sharp. You realized how rarely you spoke without editing first, how even your thoughts felt filtered before they reached your mouth. You weren't unsure of what you felt. You were unsure of what it would cost to say it. That was the change. You had learned to protect the moment instead of trusting it, to keep things smooth instead of true, to make space for others by taking less for yourself. No one asked you to do this. You just learned from what worked, learned from what didn't. And then the truth settled quietly. You hadn't learned to choose your words carefully because it felt right. You learned because it felt safer. When you learned to choose your words carefully,